provide us with questions that you'd like your county leadership to respond to, things that are on your mind. And I think we had upwards of 80, maybe 90 questions submitted. Good questions, and we've reproduced them all there for you. But what we also did is we said, we're not going to select those questions ourselves. Okay? We're going to have the people behind the curtain do that. And that would be Jason and Dan.
Okay.
Jason, who represents the PTA community, Dan, who represents a community association. We said, okay, you guys decide what you think are the relevant questions for our council, our county executives people, our planners, and our school system to respond to. And we'll give it our best shot. We don't know
I can answer your
what it's
question.
going to be.
Okay.
Okay, so one thing I do want to point out is we did go through a lot of questions. You submitted a lot. We did our best in trying to narrow these down for the time that we had, but I want to encourage you all that really the strength of today's forum is going to come in the next session, where everyone gets a chance to sit down at a round table, to have your voice heard, to ask your questions, to make your points, and all of that will be recorded, so that we'll be able to consider all of that information as we go forward. So with that, though, did want to begin. We're going to alternate questions between schools and transportation, and so I'm going to start with the schools question that kind of gets at the point of why we're here today. Mr. Crispell spoke about the role that MCPS currently plays in the county sector or master planning process. How can we more effectively integrate MCPS into that process, particularly in areas where immediate growth is more inevitable, such as White Flint or downtown Bethesda or West Bar?
Okay,
So for an example, should MCPS consider writing a section of sector plans that identifies specific solutions that would be triggered if certain development thresholds are met in the area?
I'll take that. I'm Councilmember Nancy Florine, but I will tell you I've been around this block for 30 years. I was a member of the planning board appointed in 1986, and I will tell you my first meeting, well, just before, you read these packets, they send all this stuff to you, and I will never forget it. I opened my door, and there on my door was this stack of documents. And this was back in the early days when we were working through the origins of the growth policy and how it was going to be implemented. And I am here to tell you there is no magic bullet. There isn't any simple solution. And right now I chair the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee, so we take the first shot at the master plans that we get from the Planning Commission. The school system plays a role in all of this. They certainly do. There's a couple school sites identified in the White Flint plan. But what you have to appreciate is that we do not control the school system. Now, it's either good or bad, depending upon how you think about it. But they've got a lot of options in terms of dealing with school capacity. There are 2 sites in the sector plan. They've also got closed schools right around White Flint. They make programming decisions that affect capacity. When I look back over my years in the council, I was just saying to Bruce, I think one of the crimes, you could tell me if this is a crime or not. I think it was 1984 or so when the Montgomery County Council decided to fund all-day kindergarten. Was that 94? 2006? 2006. I missed a decade there. We decided to fund on our own all-day kindergarten before it was required by the state. Now that didn't come with any money from the state, and that immediately required every school that had 2 morning and afternoon kindergarten to find space for all-day kindergarten. That started the rush to portables that we're still living with. But they also make other decisions as to where they put certain programs, special needs programs, special programs determined that they've determined are important for that community, or they're looking for a place that serves a region. They're going through that right now with respect to sites in Rockville, Aspen Hill. They make these decisions made on policy reasons, not on land use decisions per se. And we sort of have a Chinese wall between the planning work and the policy work. You elect the Board of Education separately from us, and they make those kinds of decisions on their own. At the end of the day, they send us their bill, and we go through that when we approve the budget. But the challenge is, I will tell you, MCPS is involved, but the answers are not so clear. I know there's a bit, lots of people from the West Bard area are here. Are you all from West Bard? Raise your hand. Not everyone. Good. But so people from all over the county will appreciate this. There's a close school over there. They could open if they wanted to. They can add on to additional facilities, and then maybe the neighborhood won't turn over the way you think it might. I don't know about you, but on my street, we've had 4 or 5 elderly people pass away. Those homes have been sold, but not all to families. Interestingly enough, single people, people my age, old people. This is a calculation that Mr. Crispell has to take into consideration whenever he does the school projections for the schools. So there are so many moving parts to this. I will just tell you, the master plan just sets an envelope for what could occur in an area. And you've heard from Gwen, most of the county is not actually built out to that envelope under any scenario. But we do work with the school system in terms of identifying potential sites, because we get to get those sites from applicants when they go through the process. So it's important that they do that. We want them to do that, because that's when we get to say to someone, okay, whatever you want to do there, you've got to give us X, Y, Z acres of land for a site. And that is the only way we can do it if it's identified in a master plan.
Thank you.
So I'm Kat O'Neill, I'm president of the Board of Education, and thank you. I just wanted to respond, going back to what the question originally was, our involvement in the planning process, and absolutely we should be involved. And you heard from Bruce and Casey, our working relationship with the various, agencies, MCPS and Park and Planning and the council, and absolutely we need to continue what we're doing, but there's always room for improvement. But I have to say, as someone who's been a taxpayer, who grew up in Montgomery County since 1975, Bruce talked about how MCPS had dipped. We had been at 90,000 students. We're now at 154,000 students. We know that we're going to go to more than 160,000 students. We have a problem right now without any growth. And it comes down to what Mr. Orland said. We need more money. And yes, we did make decisions, but it was in the best interest of children, of putting in all-day kindergarten everywhere, not limiting it to certain areas. And we were at over 770 portables. We're now at 430. And while that's too many, all-day kindergarten is the right thing to do. Reducing class size in our highest impact schools is the right thing to do. But we need more money to solve our problem right now and to continue working across all government agencies and across legislative bodies to find the answers to schools and to transportation.
Okay, the next question deals with transportation. The transportation growth, impact on growth is not confined to one list. For example, I live in Colesville, I work in Howard County and Rundle County. In the past, I've worked in Virginia, driven through DC. I go different places to shop and do restaurants. My question is, how does the county coordinate with municipalities and with neighboring jurisdictions to address transportation problems?
I'll start. Maybe it's not working.
This is one of there you go, thank you. Excuse me, I'll take a first crack and turn to Greg, and maybe Dr. Rowland as well, if we need it. With respect to our municipalities, our process is seamless. We take fully into account what's happening in Gaithersburg and Rockville, and when we're doing something that affects Gaithersburg or Rockville, they come in and testify and say, this is what how it's going to affect us. So when we do our tests, our projections, our sense of what we have to do in order to accommodate growth, we take a look at whatever's happening wherever it is happening. With respect to our surrounding jurisdictions, and Greg, perhaps you have some views, or Dr. Orland, actually, we haven't done as well as I think we should, and our transportation committee was the first time that we ever met with Prince George's County to talk about our transportation issues. Our committee was the first time to ever meet with Fairfax to have that. And we need to do that with Howard, and we need to do that with Frederick as well. When we think of what's happening on 29, I believe the number is close to 50% of the traffic on 29 is coming from Howard. And here we are trying to develop a rapid transit system, and it has to be with Howard, working closely together. So we need to do more. We are trying to schedule a meeting with Howard for that purpose and trying to schedule a meeting with Frederick County for that very purpose. Greg, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Thank you, Roger. You hear a lot about regionalism in the area, and I think it's important to note that while we do a good job of communicating with the municipalities within Montgomery County, from Poolsville down to Tacoma Park, we've also got to consider Fairfax County and Howard County and Prince George's County and everywhere else in the district. And so the Council of Governments does a good job at trying to herd all of those cats and keep us somewhat cohesive when we look at regional transportation issues. In particular, the commuter traffic between Northern Virginia and Montgomery County, as well as to our neighbors in Prince George's County. So I think that's a big part of it. But again, it starts from within and our outreach efforts to other counties and jurisdictions in the area.
Okay, back to schools. MCPS always seems to be playing catch-up with the way things are currently arranged. Many of today's participants expressed the concern that development should follow infrastructure instead of the other way around. Would a stricter growth policy correct this process? Some options that were suggested were enacting moratoria at lower utilization levels, or enacting moratoria based on individual schools instead of averaging it across a cluster.
So that's a really great question, and I'm going to stand up for that one because I think that it's important. You know, we have to understand where we came from to understand where we are right now. And many might not remember, but back in 2003, the Interagency on School Construction that was tasked with understanding where we were in terms of keeping pace with school construction as an entire state, said that we would have to invest $3.85 billion in 2003 dollars in order to just catch up, in order to keep pace with the current level of growth that we saw in our schools. Now, I'll remind you that back in, I think it was 2002, we had an all-time high in school construction investment of $286 million. Well, our numbers right now are currently on pace for us to be well below that, but also to be at the numbers that were the same back in 2006. And so I ask you, if we're not keeping pace, nor have we addressed what's happened before, certainly that's where we have to really focus our efforts, because the key is that if we don't get the support from the state in terms of that money that, quite frankly, is owed to us, we can't even catch up with our current pace. I mean, so I have been very passionate about going to Annapolis and talking to them, excuse me, about why it is that we need to have a different methodology when it comes to funding. And I will say this, that on the national level, I've also seen Vice President Biden, I think back at the end of February, was also talking about this and talking about infrastructure and education. It's going to have to be a comprehensive new approach in terms of how we look at funding school construction. And so I don't want to shirk the growth policy debate, but there's so much more that's with our current folks that we have in, not even just I'm talking about the future growth. We have to address that. My daughter goes to one of the largest elementary schools in the state of Maryland, Matsunaga Elementary School, that's 1,000 kids. Multiple levels, mind you. You know, I give certainly credit to our school system for trying to do all they can with what they have. We're trying to do everything that we can, but the reality is that unless we started taxing all of our taxpayers through the wazoo to make up for what the state hasn't done, which I don't think is fair to our taxpayers, you know, we find ourselves in this predicament. And so from that perspective, I think that we certainly need to keep the pressure on the state, but we also need to look at new and creative ways. And I'll just say one thing. Dr. David Lever, who heads up IAC for Maryland, actually, when I asked him this question, he was speaking at the Maryland Association of Counties 2 weeks ago, and I said, if this movement hasn't happened, if we haven't seen us keep pace, what is the state doing differently? What are you going to do to make sure that we reap additional education, school construction dollars? And he said, we're going to have to relook at what we're doing with our schools. Maybe we need to look at whether or not we have remote schooling. This is the conversation from the state. And so I want you to be aware, because you need to know that the promise of additional funding isn't coming. It's not coming. And so we need to either pressure our delegation and say and insist on it, we need to pressure our governor and insist on it, or we need to start looking at new methodologies and ways in which we can educate our children.
If I could just make a couple follow-up points. One is something that Bruce said, and he emphasized, and was emphasized in some of the other presentations, and that is that there are a number of other factors other than new housing development that are really impacting enrollment growth. In fact, they far outweigh the new growth. And so by limiting or tightening the growth policy really isn't going to deal with
That's not going to handle
a
what's
lot of
happening
the
now.
enrollment issues we're
That's
dealing
right.
with. If you look at the Down County Consortium right now,
That's right.
we are looking at a solution for the upper part for a new elementary school, the lower part of the Down County Consortium for a new elementary school, and we're also looking at a high school solution. So, and very little of that is as a result of new development.
That's right.
A second factor that I would say is that if you look at a school like what's happening in Clarksburg, Northwest, and Seneca, and this gets to the second point about whether or not we should look at individual schools, we have to remember that boundary changes are a very important part of our process. We just can't say that boundaries aren't going to change, so we always have to take that into consideration. In that area, the solution is we're going to build Seneca Valley to 2,400. It currently has about 1,250 students. And then we're going to have to look at boundary changes with Northwest and Clarksburg to deal with that issue. So there's lots of different solutions to this, and it's not as simple as saying we're going to tighten the growth policy, because that may not be the most effective way to really approach this.
I wanted to add or anticipate, I think, some of the reaction to what we're all saying up here, because I think when people hear we can't even keep up with the turnover, the population growth in the schools that's created by housing turnover, why on earth would we allow new development? And I think that deserves a direct answer. I think that Dr. Orland and Bruce had mentioned how school facilities payments work, but it bears putting that all together. If you build a new residential housing project, whether it's apartment building, condominium, townhouse, single-family houses, any kind of housing in the county, no matter where you are, you pay 90% of the cost of each additional seat that is generated by that new construction. So, and Glenn had talked about why it's not 100%, it's because recordation taxes and other tax revenues contribute towards that cost as well. So effectively, in principle, if you're developing even in a cluster that's not crowded, you're covering the cost of the new school seats that you're generating. In a crowded cluster, and this is something that Bruce touched on, but he didn't tie it together with that, you pay an additional 60%. So what does that mean? You pay, if you're in a crowded cluster between 105 and 120% of capacity, you're paying 1.5 times the cost of the capital cost of the new school seats that you're generating. What does that mean in dollars and cents terms? A single-family detached house, the basic school impact fee, the 90% payment, is about $25,000. If you're paying the additional 60%, you're looking at about $40,000 for every new single-family detached house. So, in principle, and I know a lot of people push back on this because they don't believe our generation rates, or they don't believe that those numbers are adequate, but I'm saying in principle, new construction is more than paying for its share of new school construction in crowded clusters. Now, we can have a discussion about how those numbers arrive, but I think it's important for people to keep in mind that the system is set up so that new development does in fact more than pay for its fair share of the capital cost impact that it has on the school system, particularly in crowded areas.
And if I could add one more point, agree with everything everybody said up to this point. In 2007, when the council changed the test for both the transportation and the school test, for the school test, it was a considerable tightening. And one of the debates was, if we're going to use program capacity, what should be the upwards limit? The planning board and the school board in 2007 recommended that the cutoff limit be 135%. Not 120, 135%. And the reason why they said that, and that would have been a tightening, considerable over what the previous test would have been. But the reason why they said it was, if we make it as low as 120% or lower than that, it's going to direct resources more and more for changing portables to bricks and mortar, to schoolrooms, and there won't be any money left over for modernizations. And you can see that. The modernization program over the last 10 years has not progressed nearly as fast as what folks would like. And it's very possible that if we don't get this money from Annapolis, for example, the modernization program that's been proposed might slip some more. And so all these things are everything everyone said in response to this question are right on the mark. But I just want to add that point.
Okay, I guess we're back to transportation. The county executive proposed a state bill in January that would have given the county authority to create an independent transit authority. This would have dealt with bus rapid transit and the ride-on and other things. The bill was withdrawn after much criticism. The major focus had to do with fear of raising taxes. The county executive said there needed to be much discussion about this whole area before any more legislative action is taken. What is the process for addressing issues and how will the public have an opportunity to provide their opinion?
So to reiterate, the bill that was proposed and then withdrawn was enabling legislation. And so all it would have done is given the county the authority to actually create the transit authority. The taxing element, and I'll defer to Councilmember Florine about how the county has that discussion and tax rates, is a separate discussion and a separate public process in terms of how the county council establishes tax rates.
Well, you've heard from all of us, we need more money. We need more money. That's only 4 words. Lots more money. And so I'll just say, we're always looking at new ways to find resources. Actually, some years ago, we figured out a way to fund transportation projects by selling bonds based on liquor revenues. That was our drink and drive approach, which I'm thinking we should think some more about. Because we are desperate. to find resources. Say what you will about, there were some issues about how this bill was structured, but we continue to worry about ways that are fair, that our residents can bear to generate additional revenue. And so we look at ways to create other sources. Right now you're paying a water quality protection charge. That's designed to go and protect the bay, and it's also helping to fund the things that we're doing that are protecting our environment. We've gotten very little criticism about that. We have you pay a tax on your cell phone usage. Bless you all. You also you're actually paying a transit tax right now. If you look at your property tax bill, people may not realize that. And I think the question for all of us is, given the state of finances, that we're not too optimistic that we're going to see any huge increases in revenue over the next few years. How do we generate the money that we need for these kinds of things? And I think that's what the Transit Authority was intended to achieve. One of our major transit projects, next in line after the Purple Line, is the Quarter Cities Transitway. That will generate a lot of economic activity, primarily with respect to Johns Hopkins and their big plans for the Shady Grove area, which would help with our tax base issues and expand revenue sources for us, because we are continually looking at ways to generate revenue, which without having to raise your property taxes significantly. Who got reassessed this year? I did. Our bill is going to go way up, regardless of our reassessment, of what I do with respect to property taxes when we finish up with the budget. And this is a challenge for residents in a flat economy. Can we really ask you to pay more in property taxes to fund just the regular functions of government, which is what we're looking at now? So I think the part of the Transit Authority was intended, and I hope that we will see something coming back that we can have a more prolonged community conversation about. How can we fund some of our infrastructure needs in a way that is sustainable, predictable, and reliable going into the future? Because we have the same issue with transportation objectives as we do with school funding objectives. So that's part of the background on all this. I think that conversation is going to continue.
So as chair of the Transportation Committee, let me just offer a couple observations. I do think our bus rapid transit system, the proposal to have a very large, significant bus rapid transit system starting on 355, 29, and maybe Beers Mill, is among the most important, if not the most important, single step our county can take to address so many of the issues that confront our county: quality of life, environment, where we grow, how we grow, traffic. All of that, in my judgment, are wrapped around the axle of a bus rapid transit system. So when the county executive came forward, it was a big, bold notion. But let me also say, as one who represents a good number of you, the notion of a bus rapid transit is not without its controversy. And what we made a pledge in our county council was that we would have incredible conversations with the community, route by route, before we went forward. And having an independent authority created a context in which there was, by definition, less public accountability. So it felt like it was a little premature when we are still in the design, very beginning stages of this, to move forward with an independent authority. And with respect to the tax issue really was with respect to, quote, operating costs. We already have the authority to exceed the charter limit for capital costs associated with this system by virtue of a state bill that Senator Madaleno got through the legislature. We will not know for years how much money we will need for operating costs. So to put before the public now a proposal to exceed the charter limit for something that we don't know how much we need, before we have had the full public engagement on something that is controversial, struck me and many of us as, whoa, let's put the pause button on here. So that's what we've done. And what we will do is we'll come up with cost estimates for this program. We'll figure out how to fund it. And then at that point in time, if it is deemed that we need an independent authority, we can have that conversation. But it's taking one step at a time the old-fashioned way that I think we'll get there.
I thought one of you would say, in addition to what you did say, another point is part of having a public discussion is getting facts and opinions on the table, and this is a good first start in that direction, so I want to thank you for having this meeting. And when you all go to the breakout sessions, think of all the stuff we're talking about and put your opinions on the paper.
Okay, I'm going to go back to something that Chairman Anderson talked about with regard to forecasting and those generation rates. Obviously, those generation rates go into those enrollment forecasts, but also to determine the school facility payment levels. But many people criticize those generation rates. So with regard to those, if data are available to make projections based on more cluster-specific data, why do we continue to forecast using county-wide or sub-county-wide data? Isn't it true that actual student generation rates in some area high-rises are greater than the corresponding rates used by MCPS and county planners?
Thank you.
It's all for Bruce.
The generation rates that we developed, what that means is it's the number of students on average that are yielded or generated for different types of housing. And we've done research many times over the years for 3 sub-areas of the county as sort of a starting point and a county-wide rate. But that doesn't mean that we stop at those rates and only apply those. If your cluster lands in the southwest, those rates are what we use. That's only a starting point. We have done every year, as this whole concern about multifamily housing has built, we've sampled thousands of recently occupied older multifamily structures in Bethesda, in North Bethesda, in Silver Spring, in Rockville. And I have all those numbers for the breakouts. I can show you what these are really generating. And so when we're getting a new high-rise in Bethesda, I can look at the high-rise next door that just occupied and get a much more detailed sense of what's going to be generated. So I want to dispel the notion that we only use those larger area rates. We go right down to the fine detail of the recent occupancies in the same school.
Oh, I'm up again. That's fast. The next question is probably all dear to us the last couple of days, and this is dealing with road maintenance. We've all been dodging lots of potholes. The question is actually not dealing with potholes, which could be filled, but it has to do with the general maintenance of the roads. There's a lot in the residential areas. There's a lot of roads that are crumbling, and the maintenance hasn't been kept up, resurfacing, rebuilding. Anyway, the question is, what is the county doing to address this problem?
I think we just approved additional dollars to go into the road fixing fund. Isn't that right, Greg?
Road maintenance, yep.
The road maintenance fund. We on the Transportation Committee have consistently added dollars to that fund over years, and they're pretty responsive. We try to be responsive to identified problems. I bet it's going to be a nightmare once the snow melts and we see what the mess is out there. You will probably, no doubt, keep us posted, but DOT does a very good job of focusing on these kinds of improvements. Al, are you here up there, Mr. Rashdi? You want to talk about this? This is your budget?
resources, as Mrs. Florine said, we just got the supplemental for additional residential resurfacing, and we will continue to ask for more money.
Lots more money.
Lots more money, that's the money.
There's a lot more money.
So one of the things I'm tempted to do, of course, you're not allowed to use your phone while you're driving, but when you see a pothole, take a picture and send it to us, okay, so that we can make sure that we're attending to it. I mean, I drive, as all of you do, and some of these holes, particularly with the cold weather, and then moving from the cold weather into the spring, it really plays havoc with our roads, and so we got a lot of work to do right now. So let us know if we have missed one that's near and dear to your heart.
Okay. Hello?
There you go.
Hello? Okay. So back to schools again. We've heard about the difficulty in obtaining land for schools in sector plans, where no developer generates enough students for a school, but collectively all of them do. As a result, most of the developers contribute no land. Why shouldn't developers pay for or contribute land proportionally for a school site?
Well, I have to maybe ask somebody else to help with this, but certainly I think we've had a number of instances where we have had property. So if you look across the area between Rockville and Gaithersburg, we actually have 5 sites that we've identified. I'll thank the city of Rockville. We have 2 sites in King Farm, the new Shady Grove. We have a site identified at Jeremiah Park. So in many instances, we do have this happen. And Bruce mentioned the master plan, which obviously worked a lot better in Clarksburg, where a number of sites have been identified by the elected officials and the planning board and everywhere. So again, I think that there have been a couple challenging site areas, and White Flint certainly has probably been the most challenging that we've had to deal with. But again, I think we do, in general, work closely together. There are some, I mean, if you look at some other areas, we're actually going to have to look at some of the sites that Bruce talked about. We have a large inventory. Both county has a number of them. We still have some. We have sites that have been identified, future school sites. So part of the strategy, part of the approach is really going to have to be to look at those sites that we already have available. So I think it's a combination of everything.
Let me briefly address this, and I'll be curious as to their other commentary, because this certainly came up in the context of White Flint, in which the entire White Flint development community bears some proportionate share of responsibility for what's happened, what will happen over time. What we found ourselves with, unless I'm mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that ultimately it came down to, if you will, what happens on the White Flint Mall site and the learners who own that site, and asking them, in effect, to pony up for the site and all the costs associated with it when they are just contributing a small fraction. That actually every part of the development community is contributing to it. So from my perspective, this is a great question, and one that I don't believe we have actually addressed in a way that I find satisfactory, that really the responsibility ought to be shared proportionately, and we need to find a mechanism for doing that.
Yeah, in the case of White Flint, there's no question that there's actually more than one option for White Flint. But that's a great example because it illustrates the problem of redevelopment in a place that's already built out, it's already relatively urbanized, if I can use that word. And the issue is it's becoming more residential. That when some of our central business districts were developed, as recently as the year 2000, if you read the Silver Spring Master Plan, it talks about an aspiration to bring residential development to downtown Silver Spring, but then it goes on in the very next paragraph to say, well, we realize that's probably not realistic because nobody wants to live in downtown Silver Spring. And now we see, in just the space of 15 years, a complete turnaround in the preferences that are expressed through the market and where people want to live and work. So that's part of the issue, not just for schools, but also for things like parks. where, 20 years ago, we didn't need as many parks in our downtowns because people weren't spending 24 hours a day downtown. They were going there to work from 9 to 5 and they're going home. And presumably, they were less likely to need the kinds of recreational facilities that we now find that we need in central business districts. But getting back to the example of how to pay for these school sites, part of the issue will be that that site that you mentioned at the Whitefront Mall is about 4 acres. We have an ongoing conversation, which we welcome with the school system, about what is the minimum site that's necessary for school. They're currently specifying about 7.5 acres, I believe, as a minimum preferred site for an elementary school. Well, our view is that a 4-acre site is not only adequate at a minimum, but actually can provide a very high quality school. Somerset Elementary School, which some of you may know is just down the road from here near Friendship Heights, is on a 4-acre site. And that's I think that's a beautiful school. I think anybody would be happy to have their children go to that school. Would certainly not consider it to be substandard or inadequate to deliver a high quality experience for elementary school children. Now, the issue of the proportion of the payment, the Supreme Court has said in the Dolan case that what you can require a property owner to give up in exchange for approving permission to develop has to be proportionate to their impact. There has to be a nexus between what you're asking them to pay or give up and the impact they're creating. So in the case of a 4-acre school site, if somebody has a relatively intensive development project like the one that the learners are proposing, they might generate a quarter of the students that would be expected to attend a new elementary school. So you can definitely hit them for a quarter of an elementary school site, but that'll get you 1 acre, right? And that site we're talking about, I think the value of that property is something like $20 million. So that's $5 million. Now what are we going to do about the other 15? Part of that can come from the public benefit bonus density process. Maybe you can get some other piece of it through that process. And then another part probably has to be contributed from other sources, including other property owners in the area. Some of it will have to come from the public. But all of that, I think, can and will add up eventually to identifying a site. I'm not sure that I assume it will be that one, but maybe some other site. We will identify school sites in these locations, even though they're constrained, even though there are financial challenges. I am absolutely confident that we can get that done in places like Whiteflint and Bethesda. It may require different approaches to what kind of schools we buy. George Loventhal mentioned acquiring old office buildings. I mentioned building on smaller sites. There are other possibilities that maybe we can get into this afternoon, but there's no doubt in my mind that this can be done and that we're going to be able to do it working with our friends in the school system.
Well, I just have to speak on this topic because I know a lot of you who are here today are specifically concerned about Whiteflint, about West Park, about Bethesda development. And, you're looking at your schools that are crowded now and, what's going to happen in the future. And you may be at Wood Acres where we're doing an addition, or Westbrook where we just completed a 12-room addition, and you're thinking forward and really worried about what does this hold. And, it's challenging. I know there are a lot of conversations about the West Park development, and parents are concerned, community members are concerned. And, it is challenging, it's expensive, and we have a problem right now with school crowding in these very same communities.
If I could just add on with respect to the Whiteflint thing, the other issue, and I think Bruce, maybe others have referred to this earlier, we've got a lot of closed schools. There are 3 right around Whiteflint. There's Grosvenor, well that's now a holding school. There's Rocking Horse. There's the HOC site in Kensington. Those could all be used to serve the population now, much less those going into the future. There are other closed schools near West Park. Of course, there are people in them, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. But that is the kind of challenge that the Board of Ed has in sorting this out. I think, was it Roger who said earlier, you know, it's insanity to keep doing the same thing over and over again. And the question is, are we willing to think differently? But just remember, you know, once you get into that, you get into a whole lot of community expectation challenges that I know that the board works very hard to address and to work through. So these are, what I think is important for everyone to understand is that folks are worrying about these issues for you. These are real, these are options, and they all have issues associated with them. And I think this isn't the important thing to understand. There is no single one solution that works well for every community, and that's where we really respect what the board does in trying to chart a path that serves both the people who are having additional children in their existing communities, the new folks who are moving in, and what's the best solution for our community as we move forward into the future.
Okay, well, we have a lot more questions to get through, but we're running out of time, so I think we're going to pass off. If I could just ask one quick question now, and I think this helps lead into the next conversation, and that is, if you could, even just by giving a number, or maybe 3 numbers, one for elementary school, one for middle school, and one for high school, how big is too big in terms of enrollment?
It's static.
So I mean, we had just adopted ranges for schools, so elementary schools go up to 740. We do have some schools that are over that right now. We have Ashburn that's just come forward and asked to go higher than that. So middle school is 1,200, high school's at 2,400. We're building both Seneca Valley and Wheaton are at least going to be planned out for 2,400. So those are the new ranges. Obviously, there's different points of view about what is too large. This is very obviously way different than the 50s and 60s and early 70s when we were building 5 and 6 schools a year, but most elementary schools at that time were 200 to 300 students and on much smaller pieces of property. So I think this is we think is an efficient way, but also a very manageable way for our educational leaders and teachers to provide quality education within these limits.
I just wanted to say very briefly that I think that, again, what we don't need to get hung up on is the total capacity of the entire school, and making sure that we also, that we have levels of class size and student-teacher ratios. And that's where the most important thing is. Being the son of a teacher, I can tell you that a teacher will tell you it's not about the total number of students that are in a school, but the number that are in the classroom and the challenges that they're facing with those particular students that matters when it comes to the success of our kids. Now, I will say this, when it comes to the overall footprint of the school, we also need to make sure that we're looking at things differently. There's a lot of new data that's out there in terms of how we can creatively build our schools, working with public-private partnerships, and really give us a difference. Co-locations, all of those things matter. We need to start looking at that and doing things differently because our world is changing. We're not growing additional space, and so we're going to have to make accommodations within what we have before us. And so I think that there has to be a new methodology and a new approach to how we do business within our schools.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, ladies and gentlemen, we heard the applause not for our responses, but for the questions. So clearly, for some of these issues, there are questions that you really feel we need to spend more time on. And that's the point of this next session, which is go back to the cafeteria. We will now have staff from all of county government help facilitate a conversation that you direct, in which we say, what did you hear today? What do you feel is the unfinished business? What more do we need to attend to? Because then that will help us guide us going forward for the rest of the day. All right? So go back to the cafeteria now, find a table, and let's get to work collectively.
That's it.